Good evening. Open your Bibles, if you would, to John chapter 13. John chapter 13 will be the text we'll begin with in just a moment. One of the things that we don't often realize is how God uses us for His purpose, how He uses us to bless others. Sometimes that's apparent and obvious, but often, perhaps more than not, it's not so obvious. So this young couple, was baptized into Christ, changing their eternal destiny and their family trajectory. They'd come from a background of brokenness and even hostility toward God. And so the change in their life, the peace, the joy that they experienced was exciting to be a part of. And that happened because some of us had an opportunity to open the Bible and show them who God is and what He would call them to be. But really that happened because some had decided that they would help them with a wedding, because they didn't know about all of that, and they were trying to figure out where to get married, and they didn't have a lot of money, and especially in that particular town, the wedding venues were pretty expensive. And so there were people that were willing to help them with a wedding, and there's very few things as relaxing as a wedding. But people served in all of that relaxation. But really, the reason that they had a wedding at the church building is because they were driving by trying to figure out where to do this, and they looked over and they said, "Oh, that's a nice place." And they walked in and said, "Could we get married here?" And the reason why they said this is a nice place is because there's one brother that insisted on mowing the lawn and trimming the hedges and taking care of the grounds. And I always like to remind, because those of us that preach and teach, we often get to be a part of when the harvest happens, but it never starts there. It's a chain of events, of seed planted that grows, and we get to see a harvest and maybe some other amazing things, but there's always been folks involved far prior to that moment. And so to the guy that mows the lawn, you think, well, it's not like I'm really doing something. God uses those things. For those who bake casseroles, God uses casseroles to His glory, amen? Especially some of the ones I've been seeing. And I appreciate those that take the time to video, as they have in the back, and the sound, and I've already put it on the internet, and I've already heard from 3 different people in 2 different states that they appreciate it, and it's encouraged them in some way. I get to hear that, but the people that do the video, and then they go home and they spend hours in front of a computer doing the editing and uploading, you never hear about that. So I like to say to those who serve, whatever you do, when you do it in the name of Christ, you are allowing God full access to do His great work through all of our meager efforts. Amen? And so just thank you for all of those things and more. John chapter 13, Jesus gives a commandment and a purpose. I'm of the opinion that there may be nothing more critical, or at least more impactful, in our world today. This may be the most powerful thing we can do in terms of sharing our faith or sharing Jesus or being a part of evangelism, that the biggest difference we could make in our world today is being good friends. That ability and that experience seems to be getting more rare by the moment. I remember the last election cycle, and I've been dreading this one since the last one. But I remember the last election cycle, the voices saying that love trumps hate. And I'm thinking, how do you say love when you're screaming it with a scowl on your face? Regardless of where you're coming from politically, my point is, it seems to me that our world is quickly losing the ability to have friendships, authentic relationships. We are the most connected and the most isolated people, it seems, in history. So Jesus tells His disciples, and He tells us, in verse 34, He says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." It's not an option. And the reason why it's a commandment, I suspect, is because it's not something we're going to do necessarily on our own. Because there are times when it's hard, painful, and risky. But he also gives us a picture or a qualifier to say, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. Now I have a picture of what that would look like. And then he says, by this all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. Jesus says this will be the identifying characteristic of my people. He'd said in the Sermon on the Mount that we're to be the salt of the earth. He said that we're to be a light to the world, like a city on a hill. And he's saying here, I believe, what constitutes the light. Later, John would be used to pen 1 John, and he would say that God is love. In a world that desperately needs to know how to do that. We're even questioning today if it's even possible. Does anybody have trust issues? Are we in an environment where you have been conditioned to distrust everything you hear or see? Think about just the media that communicates ideas. And I don't even have to be political. Did you know that if you buy a certain brand of soap, it will change your life? That we are so bombarded by just the advertising concept, and it's all about trying to get our attention or clickbait or get us to scroll across it. And it's always about this huge promise that never delivers. I was reminded of a blast from the past. This is something, this section over here, you're just going to have to use your imagination. We used to get these little thin books filled with colorful drawings, and we called them comic books, right? And the really cool thing is when you turned them on, they always came on, you know what I mean? And you didn't swipe this way, you swiped this way, right? And then if you missed something, you could swipe the other way and you could go back, right? But what I remember most was in the back of these comic books was always an advertisement of something you could buy, and there were three things that always caught my eye. One of them, you could buy your very own ballistic submarine that was 7 feet long. Does anybody remember that one? The second thing that I've always wanted is you could buy your own hovercraft and you could soar across town and be the envy of all of your friends as you sailed across all of their houses and you just had to mail in a check. The problem is none of us had checks. We were reading comic books. Hello? But if you would just send a money order, you could get your very own nuclear submarine, you get your very own hovercraft, or you could get your very own American Army complete with tanks and ships and airplanes. Well, I couldn't afford the submarine, and I couldn't afford the hovercraft, but I actually got to send off and get my very own army. And they had the bazooka men and the machine gun, and they had airplanes, and they had ships, and it came in its very own ammo box. When it came in, I got a little bitty cardboard box. Turns out that was submarine material. A friend of mine that got the nuclear submarine got 7 feet of thin cardboard submarine. And it had the little green plastic army men. Does anybody remember what I'm talking about? And I remember the crushing disappointment. This was not what was in the photo. That's the world we live in that promises this is fantastic. And we're so inundated by it, we don't even realize how distrustful, how cynical, and how negative we are naturally. Because if you're not, you're going to be made a fool because of the lie or the dishonesty or the deceit in the very nature of advertising. We're surrounded by it. I can't check the weather on my phone without another ad popping up that's promising something. Maybe more rain, I don't know. And so what happens is we live in a culture and in a world that is so connected but is so cynical that we think that about each other. It seems to me that Jesus' commandment is as critical and as bright shining as it's ever been. Turn to chapter 15. This has been the hub text, if you will, that we've used now in our days together. But incredibly, in this beautiful text, he brackets the central idea with the same commandment. In chapter 15, verse 12, he says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you." And then he said, "Greater love has no one than this, than one lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing. But I have called you friends, for all things I've heard from my Father have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you. And I appointed you that you would go and you would bear fruit, and that your fruit would remain, so that whatever you ask of the Father in my name he may give to you. This I command you, that you love one another." So over the course of 6 different lessons, we've looked at the different concepts just in that paragraph, all spinning around the idea of friend as a fulfillment of his desire in verse 11, because he said, "I want you to have my joy, and I want you to have it to its full or completeness." And the only way you'll experience that joy and that peace is if you are a friend of Jesus. But he bracketed that on both sides with that we love one another. In Matthew chapter 6, he will tell us that we are to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, the end of chapter 5, rather. But I'm going to ask you to turn to 1 Corinthians. So we could continue to look at multiple times that Jesus says, this is what it's about. But it's important that if I understand this is what Jesus is calling me to do, that this is what we are called to experience with him, with each other, and to offer the world that desperately needs what we've experienced. But I also have to understand what it is he's talking about. Because to say that we live in a cynical world is also to say we live in a world that doesn't understand love. Love is simply and merely and most often defined as emotion. It's how you feel about someone. Our movies and our music teach us that when you find someone that is your soulmate, you'll know it because of how you feel about them. And it's going to be fantastic, and you're just going to feel so wonderful. It's going to be intoxicating, and that's how you'll know that you're with a person you're supposed to be. In fact, we're told that the universe, not God, but the universe has this will and this wish that would guide us to that one person that would make us feel like that all the time. Is anybody married? Okay, has anybody been married longer than, how long would it take, folks? 3, 4 weeks? I'm asking the old married folks, has there ever been a time in your relationship when you have not felt great about who you're married to? Look right at me. Don't look sideways. Look right here. I'm trying to save your life. Don't flinch. One of the amazing things, if we had the courage to just have an open conversation, if I were to ask the room tonight with all the marriages represented, was there ever a time in your marriage where you thought to yourself, maybe you never verbalized it, but was there ever a time when you thought to yourself, I may have made a mistake? If I were to just ask that question in a show of hands, but then if I were to ask a second question, has your marriage brought you a deep sense of fulfillment and joy and growing in love? What's interesting is more often than not, the same people would raise their hands. Often we gain a depth to our relationships when we've been through some things. Perhaps another way to illustrate it, if I were to ask you just about a friend, if I were to say, tell me your best friend, and you said, well, it's so-and-so. And if I ask you, tell me who you can really count on, you say, well, it's so-and-so. Tell me someone that you know no matter what, they have your back. You say it's so-and-so. How do you know that? Because it's been experienced over time, because they have had your back, because you've been in a jam, because they have come. In other words, it takes those kinds of experiences to develop that kind of depth. But if all I'm thinking is, it's about how I feel and this feels so wonderful, what happens when it doesn't feel wonderful? You stay. You continue in friendship. Because that's when the relationship grows. Our world today often says, whoa, this doesn't feel so good all of a sudden. Must have made a mistake. Maybe the universe guided me to the wrong soulmate, so maybe I'll be guided to another one. And we never understand the power and the depth of growing a relationship, be it marriage or be it friendship even. And so the Bible defines for us love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 is one place, and it's not described as an emotion. Is it possible to be angry with somebody that you love? Yeah, I don't have to go over that again, do I? And so, in other words, you can have negative emotions about a person that you would die for. That's interesting, isn't it? Paul says love in verse 4, love is patient. So when Jesus says love your enemies, when he says love your brothers and sisters in Christ, love one another, he's not talking about this is so wonderful, I just feel so good being around you. That's true sometimes. But it's not true all the time, and it's when we love, when we don't want to, that the relationship truly deepens. So love is patient. If you're having to be patient, how do you feel when you say, I'm being patient right now? Well, it's not positive how you feel if you're being patient. How about this? Love is kind and is not jealous. Can we be kind to one another? Can we be kind to those who do not know Christ? Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own. Remember, we talked about the relationship that might begin in fear, that we've got to do what we're told or else we'll have negative consequences, but we grow to a place, we might say, fortune of I'm going to do what I should because I'll get something good from it. But those two are still self-centered reasons. We want to grow to friendship where I want to do this because I want to do what's good for you. And then the relationship changes or moves into a whole other place. He says, love does not seek its own. Love does not take into account a wrong suffered. Love is forgiving. That means love is not embittered, that love doesn't keep score. Does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Jesus said that the greatest commandment in Matthew chapter 22, we looked at last night about verse 37, that the greatest commandment was to love God with all your soul, your strength, and your mind. And he said the second is like it, to love your neighbors yourself. And he said the entire law and the prophets hinge or hang or depend upon those two things. That is what God has called us to since the beginning, to love him and to love one another. Everything else is commentary or illustration about how to do that. So now we get to this question. So we've heard this, we've read this, it's not new information. There's probably no one here tonight that says to themselves, I didn't know that. We've all heard it before. So now the important question becomes, why? Why? Why should we do this? I think we know the what, and we have a good start on even the how, but why? Recently, Ruth and I were in Houston with a family there and just being with them during a funeral and sitting across the table at a meal. They had prepared a meal for the family and friends that had gathered. And this young lady was telling me how excited she was about this new curriculum that she had developed and how she's being allowed to bring this into some of the schools in the greater Houston area. And it was about character development. Because it's interesting that it's a growing hunger in our culture and in our businesses that we're looking for character development. And I said, well, tell me about that. She goes, well, we've got this curriculum and we're working with the elementary school age kids, and we're teaching them that they need to be kind to one another. They need to be nice to one another. And I said, that's fantastic. Can I ask you a question? And she said, yeah, because she was excited about changing lives and changing people and changing communities. And I said, what's your why? She said, what do you mean? I said, well, when you're teaching kids to be kind, why should they be kind? Do you tell them this is why you should be kind? And she said, I hadn't thought about that. So you tell the little kids to be kind when they're being mean and bullying's wrong and all that. I said, well, tell me your why. Why do you do it? She goes, well, I want them to be kind to each other because that will make the other person be appreciative, and that's how you stop bullying. And I said, not always. I said, is it possible that a child could be kind to another child and they're not changed and they continue to be ugly back? Is that possible? So then what happens to your why? She said, well, I want them to be kind because I want them to realize that when they're kind to other people, they'll feel better about themselves. I said, not always. Is it not true? Have you ever been kind to someone and they didn't appreciate it and you didn't feel good about that at all? See, those are still elementary principles. I'm going to do this because of what I get out of it. If it's always just what I get out of it, it will never be enough. Because there'll be times and places and people that what you get out of it's not worth getting. Am I right? Amen. If you're taking notes, where we stopped in John chapter 15, read the rest of the chapter. Because then Jesus, not accidentally, talks about how the world has hated him and how the world will hate them and how it's going to be hard. So there'll be times when if it's what I get out of it isn't going to be enough. There has to be a why that matters most. So let's circle back a little bit. Let's go back to Genesis. We talked about this Sunday night, so I just want to do a little bit of a review to end up perhaps with a why that matters. So I want to remind you to Genesis chapter 3, as Eve is standing there facing this temptation from Satan. And what we were asking about when we were exploring this a couple of days ago or so is, what is the heart of the temptation? And I'm sure there are several layers, I'm sure. But at least one of the things we noticed, because the way the scriptures describe this, the serpent says to the woman in verse 4, "Oh, you surely will not die, for God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was a delight to the eyes, and the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. She gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And what we noticed, if you look across in chapter 2, in verse 9, in chapter 2, verse 9, every tree is described in a similar way. Verse 9 said, "Out of the ground the Lord caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food, and the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." Every fruit-bearing tree is described as pleasing to the sight and good for food. So when you go back to chapter 3, verse 6, the woman sees that the tree is good for food and delight to the eyes. That's not the problem. All the trees look that way. So what's unique is the third description: the tree was desirable to make one wise. And then we stopped and asked the question, what's wrong with that? If you've read through the book of Proverbs at all, if you've read through the book of Ecclesiastes at all, those are two books that lift up the importance of desiring wisdom and gaining wisdom. Solomon does a lot of contrasting the fool and the wise, the fool and the wise. Jesus talks about growing in wisdom. When wisdom is understood as the ability to apply knowledge, why is wisdom negative? How could wisdom be a temptation to Eve that would bring such havoc and destruction? And so we went from there to the book of James, chapter 1. So the tree was good, pleasing to the eye. All of them were. Okay. The fruit was good to eat. All of them were. It was desirable to make one wise. So is wisdom bad? James chapter 1, verse 5, James says, "But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God." So another place where we should be pursuing wisdom. Wisdom isn't the problem. Where you get your wisdom is the problem. Satan is offering her wisdom, which, of course, isn't going to be. But when James started this letter, when we got to verse 2, he said, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance." Now we're getting back to a why, because you could say you should have joy. How am I going to have joy? Because joy produces endurance. So, verse 4, "Let endurance have its perfect result, that you be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Lacking in what? What are we talking about? Verse 5, "But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him." How different would humanity's experience be if, when Eve stood there, listening to what Satan said, if she'd have said, "Can you hold that thought? I'll be right back." And if she'd have run over and said, "God, can I ask a point of clarification? You said we would die. He says we won't. Can you help me with that?" We mentioned that the garden scene may be the first example of biblical idolatry. Idolatry is where you replace God with someone else or something else. Because how different might it have been when Eve ate it? Because I mentioned before, I've always considered Adam, when I've read that story in Genesis 3, as kind of a knuckle dragger, because the wife's standing there and she's talking, Eve's talking about, well, Satan, God said this. Satan said, "Oh, no, he didn't mean that." And she's having a conversation. The text says she turns and hands it to Adam and he eats it. At least she was asking questions. He's like, "Okay, yeah, sounds good, crunch, What if the reason that Adam doesn't have any conversation is because he makes a choice? In other words, what would have happened if Adam hadn't eaten the fruit? Well, we know the result. We know they're going to get kicked out of the garden. We know that curse is going to come upon their life. We know that they're going to die in their separation from God. What would have happened if Adam would have said, "I'm not eating that, honey. God said not to"? Would he not have been separated from Eve? I realize we're in the realm of the theoretical, but still. How important was Eve to Adam? Was he not alone? Didn't God make Eve just for him? Didn't God cause all the animals to go by Adam so he could name them and try to see if there's a companion for him? And there was none, and so he fell in a deep sleep, and God took from his side a rib and made Eve, and Adam looked at her and said, "Whoa, man," right, when he saw her? How important was she to him? I wonder if what happened was Adam deciding that she was more important to him than God. What would have happened if Adam would have said, "Stay right there, honey, don't move," and hit a run back? God, you got to help her. You got to help her. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Nobody's asking God anything. In Genesis 3, James says, if you're looking for wisdom, ask God. He wants to give it to you. But I'd like to continue in the text here in James. Look in verse 12. There's a lot here. We're just sort of ricocheting off some of these amazing truths. He comes back to what he had said about the trials in verse 12 when he says, "Blessed is a man who perseveres under trial." He'd been talking about that in those opening verses. "For once he's been approved, he'll receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him." That this purpose of trials, James says, that you experience joy in is when you understand that it brings you to completion, and that's ultimately, verse 12, the final destination of heaven. There's a verse that I think, and you can decide what you think, I think I've put it in the wrong category. Because what happens next is James describes how this happens. Whether we're talking about Eve, whether we're talking about Adam, or whether we're talking about us. He says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil. He himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by his own lust. And then when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." So he describes the process of the decay or the slow fade, that Eve stops and has a conversation with Satan through the serpent. And this could have been broken at any time if she'd have run to Adam or run to God and say, "What is this?" But where there is a temptation, where there is a response, For the temptation is not yet the sin, because the Bible says that Jesus was tempted in all things in the book of Hebrews like we are, yet without sin. I'm hoping there's another chocolate pie over there tonight. They keep appearing. It's like a magic table. It just keeps showing up over there. So far, nobody has brought any raisin turnover things, right? Because, well, this is holy ground, and why would you bring raisins to holy ground? If there is one over there, you will be amazed at my self-control. I'll walk by that table, and I'll be like, I'm going to eat healthy tonight. Now, if the chocolate pie is back, forget it. Temptation is not doing wrong. Temptation is having a response. And so I don't have a response to raisins. Well, I do, but it's not one that I want to have some. But chocolate pie, I do have a response to. Ooh, I like that. What James says is, there'll be something that Satan will troll by you, and what he's looking for is something that you respond to. But having that interest or that reaction, that's not sin. What happens next is a pursuit. We talked about being a friend with God is about pursuing God. Remember, Moses said, if you're not going, I'm not going, right? Lust is, by definition, a pursuit. So temptation is an initial response like, ooh, I kind of, comma. Lust is, and now there's a pursuit. And there's an old expression, if you could, eventually you will. Because you're pursuing something, and then eventually that will cause you in your heart and in your body to sin. And then what James says is, and that's what brings death. Not just in the garden, but in our own lives and in our own relationships. Death, decay, rot, disease. I always felt like that's where the paragraph ended. At the end of verse 16, when James says, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Because that's the nature of sin, is it's deceitful. That's what Satan's doing to Eve, is lying to her. Oh no, you won't die. He's splitting hairs. It's true she didn't drop dead, but they were broken in their relationship with God and with each other. That's death. That's what Satan does, is murky everything up, cloud everything up, lies to you, deceives you. Oh, this will help you. It's the comic book ads at the end of the book. Boy, this is what you need. And you get in it, you're like, this is plastic or cardboard. It's not real. So I always sort of thought James was putting a bow on it and saying, so don't be deceived by this deceit of sin. And for some reason, I just sort of stopped reading at that point. I would suggest that James is introducing the purpose of the paragraph in that verse, rather than a conclusion. Because when he says, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren, every good thing and every perfect gift is from above. The pursuit of wisdom is a beautiful thing. It's something God calls us to. But James says, don't be lied to, that every good gift, how many does that leave out? Every good gift, that every perfect gift comes from God. No one else. So I wonder if the core temptation for Eve, for Adam, for me is, I'm going to decide what I need. Think about how often we help God. Or is God enough? But I need this too. Or I need this too. He made a promise to Abraham and Sarah, you're going to have a son, and you're going to have more descendants than the stars of the heaven and the sands of the seashore. And then God waited. It would have been nice if God would have said that, and then all of a sudden Sarah's expecting a baby, and then to have the son 9 months later. That would have been nice to have this instant confirmation all along the way. But God promises it, and decades pass. Why does he do that? Because he likes messing with your mind. Is that why? Why does God make such a grand and powerful promise and then take forever to fulfill it? I would say the whole Bible is about God saying just 2 words: trust me. So why does he delay? To teach them to trust him. But what happens? Time passes. Well, we're getting older. And so I guess we better, and then the suggestion comes up, well, why don't you have a son with my handmaiden Hagar, and Ishmael's born? They help God because God got in a jam. He made a promise he's having trouble fulfilling on, so they fix it. They figure it out. How much time do we spend fixing or figuring when we're supposed to be waiting? Oh, I don't like waiting. And so they help God out. And that caused a problem, and the descendants of Ishmael and Isaac are still squabbling in the Middle East today. If they'd have just waited. James says, don't be deceived. God is the source of every good and perfect gift. You won't get it anywhere else. Don't find your own solution. Don't fix your own problem. Wait on God to provide. I think that's what Satan said. We looked in Matthew chapter 4 when the Spirit leads Jesus out in the wilderness and he doesn't eat for 40 days. Satan shows up and says, turn these stones to bread. And Jesus said in response, well, in the book of Leviticus it says the 11th commandment, thou shalt not turn stones into bread. No, there's no prohibition of turning rocks into bread. Why? Well, because you can't. Doesn't make any sense. Well, then what's the temptation? What would be the sin if Jesus says, all right, fine, that looks like a cheeseburger from here, and turns it into one? I wonder if the core temptation is God led him into the wilderness where there's no food, and Jesus is being tempted, so why don't you provide for yourself? Obviously, God forgot, God didn't know, God hadn't gotten around to, that you don't have any food, so why don't you take care of it? And what Jesus said was, oh, wait. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. I got everything I need. If God leads us to it, that's that expression, right? Then will God lead us through it? James says, don't be deceived. God is the giver of every good and perfect gift. You won't get it anywhere else. Why would Jesus say so regularly that we should love one another? Because it's the path to every good and perfect gift. Why would God say I got to love my enemies and pray for those that persecute me? Because God is the giver of every good and perfect gift. But I'm not going to. Do you understand the risk? Do you know how they're going to treat me? If I don't look out for myself, if I don't take care of number one, if I don't handle it, who's going to? God is the only giver of every good and perfect gift. James says, don't be deceived. He is the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. God is not whimsical. God doesn't play games. God is a faithful friend that you can always count on. He never pulls a rug out from under you. He never changes the rules of the game. He doesn't say when they're in the storm and Peter says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you. It's not like Jesus said, hey, watch this. Yeah, come on out. And Peter went down. That's not who Jesus is. Because that's not what friends do. Friends don't hurt and harm one another. Friends are loyal to each other. Friends are consistent with each other. That's why when I said, do they have your back? Yes, they do. Why? Because they've demonstrated it. Peter was able to walk on the water because when Jesus said come, he also provided. There's no shifting shadow. There's no variation in God. James says, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth so that we might be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. This is what our world desperately needs. The same thing we need in our life. To not be deceived. So here we are. We tell folks, hey, come to church with me. Hey, let's study the Bible together. You really need to give your life to Jesus. Why? Well, because he'll save you forever. Because he's the real source of peace and joy. They've heard that from soap commercials. I know they've heard it from perfume commercials. And I know they've seen it in car commercials. You're just another voice. They've heard all that before. James says, so don't be deceived. When we love one another, Jesus says, that's the light on the hill. That's the light of the world, the city on the hill, the salt of the earth. That's what's different. So what's our why? Okay, so we should love one another. Got it. We should even love our enemies. Okay, I heard that. Why? There's only one why that matters. It's true that sometimes it'll really feel good. You'd be like, I did a good thing here. But not always. It's true that sometimes you'll love somebody and they'll appreciate it and they'll thank you for it and you'll say, man, I'm glad I did that. But there's times they won't. The reason that we would love one another is because God is the only giver of every good and perfect gift. I don't have to provide in the wilderness. He will. I don't have to learn how to walk on water. He'll provide. If we are with our friend, there is no wilderness. James says, if you want to know, if you want to grow, he'll teach you. So tonight I ask you what your why is. I appreciate so much all the time y'all have invested in driving and spending time with us and serving and all the things that we've enjoyed over the last number of days. So let me encourage you one more time by James's words. So brethren, don't be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, our Father whom we serve. Can we help you in any way? We offer this invitation, not for the last time, but for this time tonight. Have you chosen Jesus to be your friend? You remember he said, you didn't choose me. He said, I chose you, but we have to accept that invitation. Would you desire to choose Jesus to be your friend? If you're sitting here skeptical and you're like, I've heard these church advertisements before, then I encourage you to spend time looking at him and not others. For he's a friend who will never, ever, ever desert you. Will he allow you to endure a wilderness or a trial or a difficulty? Yeah, sure he will. But you won't be there by yourself. For many of us, we've made that decision, but we struggle to stay focused. What Peter said in 2 Peter 1 is apply all diligence, that focus and intensity. Sometimes we're not all that intense. Can we encourage you in that and lift you up and walk alongside of you as together we walk with our friend? For he has called us to be friends with each other. So if we can encourage you in any way tonight, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing.